Good morning everyone and welcome to Lessons Learned when delivering flood defence schemes in Scotland, supported by McLaughlin Harveys and Construction Scotland Innovation Centre. Flooding is a challenge that our built environment is often forced to overcome as a result of climate change. There are regular flood events in our national news, and these headlines are compacted by rising rainfall and global temperatures, affecting every part of our daily lives, where we work, where we live, where we learn and where we play. Today, you'll hear about McLaughlin Harveys' recent experience in delivering flood defence, where we can demonstrate projects that apply state-of-the-art technology and pioneering design. The original plan was to also hear from University of Glasgow, the research lab called the Water Lab, Dr. Valerikis. Unfortunately, he's had to send his apologies today, but we do have his presentation at hand and will forward it around after today's event. For those of you that do not know me, my name is Fiona MacDonald and I'm an Innovation Manager at Construction Scotland Innovation Centre. And before we get underway, I'd like to highlight some housekeeping points just to help the webinar run as smoothly as possible, because we've got fantastic attendance today with over 180 registrations. So the session will be recorded and available to view on YouTube earlier next week. If you would like to ask any questions, please do, and please leave that comment by clicking on the questions in the control panel, type your question and press send. We will try to answer as many questions as possible, and those we don't get around to will follow up accordingly after today's event. Just to finalise that it's really quite important in terms of your feedback after today's event, so we will be seeking a response in terms of your thoughts and opinions on how today went, but just to really emphasise that your questions are just as important too. So I appreciate that some of you may not know who we are and what we do here at Construction Scotland Innovation Centre. So just to give you a bit of a background on the context, I'll take a couple of minutes to outline some of our activities here at CSIC. So as I said, we are working in partnership today with McLaughlin Harveys and their expert team. CSIC are the only innovation centre that specialises within a built environment context, so obviously completely relevant to today's theme. We're the beacon of innovation for the built environment, so we're responsible for ensuring that the sector changes to create more sustainable practices, improving society's changing needs, all with a view to create the best economic outlook for Scotland. We see innovation as the value that as the change that unlocks new value, and today's projects really demonstrate how change can be made. We are one of a family of innovation centres, as I noted previously, the only one that's built environment specific, but we do cross paths with some of our sister organisations, namely Data Lab, Census and iBioIC. So we are funded collaboratively as an initiative by Scottish Government, supported also by Scottish Funding Council, Scottish Enterprise and Highlands and Islands Enterprise. We are deliberately positioned to sit right in the middle of industry, public sector and academia, and that's really to make sure that change is driven by industry, for Scotland. We are the heart that sits in the middle and links all these benefits together to create change. Some of these come in the form of innovation projects. To date, we've delivered around 355, and as a result of these projects, you really see the economic impact for Scotland by way of cost savings, additional revenue, jobs safeguarded and created. And really, when we move into the next chapter of our delivery within CSIC, the net zero carbon agenda at a government level is absolutely crucial and core to all of the activities we take going forward. When we consider our impact within a net zero carbon potential, we see that construction, our sector, uses 60% of the materials, but also creates 47% of UK carbon emissions. So if we change just a little bit, the impact in a positive way could be a lot. We have 4 different streams of activity: digital transformation, advanced manufacturing, building sustainably, and culture. We see these as the core pillars that underpin net zero carbon change for our environment and for our industry. Some of our activities take a different shape and form depending on the nature of the needs. Our connected ecosystem, very much so around the network that we've been establishing over the last 7 years, and using our network in Scotland, UK and beyond to really push industry in the right direction and open up opportunities for everyone. Collaborative projects take the shape and form of innovation funding that we have that's available to apply for. Again, industry-led, but we buy out the academic expertise with one of Scotland's universities to support the progress of your project. The Innovation Factory we have in Blantyre, whereby we are unlocking accessibility to a number of pieces of equipment centred around off-site construction and sustainable materials. And that equipment is available for everyone and can be used by way of commercial funding, finance, or through funding from other sources. So we can create a position of being a research partner if you are going for a larger bids, and draw on our expertise within the Innovation Factory to progress your innovation projects. And Future Skills is really supporting our industry move in the right direction and address some of the skill shortages, in addition to some of the commercial challenges we have in keeping our skills as to where they need to be, whilst filling the gaps and some of the new skills that are developing with the change and progress of our industry. Some examples of our work, the K-brick you may have heard of. It's had quite a lot of publicity. It's a brick made from 90% recycled, difficult to recycle materials. It's not fired, so there's significant carbon savings, and at end of life it's very circular. It can be broken down and created into a new brick, something that could really revolutionise how we build. Offsite Solutions Scotland is a collaboration that was set up with a number of Scottish businesses operating within the offsite capacity, bringing them together to share the risks and reward for joint research and development projects, but also positioning them with a longer term view that they could collaborate as one business and move forward into international markets. Glue-lam solutions and robotic cross-laminate timber joints. We talk a lot about cross-laminate timber in Construction Scotland Innovation Centre. The reason being because the potential of unlocking the timber market in Scotland would be significant impact commercially, economically, and with the creation of a number of jobs. So we like to encourage projects with cross-laminate timber, testing the boundaries, testing Scotland's process to build. And this was actually the 7-storey flatted development in Yoker and Glasgow, using CLT and demonstrating how we can make this work in a Scottish capacity, but within a global marketplace. Remote building inspection framework, very much so assessing the developing needs of our industry, how we can be more efficient and impactful with our time and resources, but also acknowledging where we were within a COVID capacity and what can be done relative to BIM and remote working with more precision and accuracy. COVID Smart, really a reaction to the COVID pandemic, whereby we created a resource centre where we could support our industry in moving forward as the change in regulations and change in restrictions came into play. And this is something that's still up to date and it's still open for all our industry to access as a resource bank, and helping them decide what to do next and how to manage their operations appropriately. And as you can see, we run a number of different types of projects, touching on a number of different types of themes. On the back of today's theme of flood defence, we would like to do a lot more within this infrastructure, and we hope that today showcases what can be done in a practical sense, with scope for future projects in an innovation capacity. And just moving on to today's agenda, we are joined today by the McLaughlin Harveys team: Lee Davison, Head of Submissions; David Baskin, Senior Contracts Manager; Robin Erskine, Senior Contracts Manager; Adrian Pollock, Contracts Manager; and John McCreary, Senior Technical Manager. As I noted, unfortunately Dr. Valerikis has had to send his apologies, but we do have the presentation at hand and he will be able to answer any questions specifically to the water lab and the operations he has there. We'll then end today with a question and answer session, so as I said, please do take the opportunity to ask questions within the chat function, and then we'll close today's event. And at that stage, I'll be passing over to Lee, Head of Submissions at McLaughlin Harveys, just to talk about his project, some of the experience, and we'll take it from there. Lee, over to you.
Yep, thanks Fiona. Just share my presentation if I can. Show screen, 2 seconds. That should be shown, is that okay?
It's perfectly, thank you.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. So just running through the team as Fiona presented. So speaking today, we've got Robin Erskine, who's looking after our Hawick flood protection scheme, David Baskin on Stonehaven, myself just doing a quick introduction, Adrian Pollock looking after Upper Garnock, and John McCreary talking through what we're doing on our Broughty Ferry project. So the aim of the session today is to, we have 4 current live projects on in Scotland, and it's to share lessons learned. Predominantly the aim which from the attendee list has been successful is to speak to councils and consultants, to share lessons learned of aspects of project that from a contractor's perspective have gone really well, in terms of the advanced works that the client teams have done, things that really benefit the project, and also to highlight where there's been potential issues, or we've encountered some issues that possibly weren't fully considered at design stage, but not in a the intent not being to be critical, just to be highlighting issues and for future schemes to point out what could be considered in a potentially better way, and probably the best outcome for us is to try and drive in consultants and clients' heads the benefits that it can bring through speaking to us as an experienced contractor in this field to bring people on board at an early stage and hopefully avoid some of these potential problems. So schemes we'll be speaking about today: Hawick, 6 kilometres of flood defences through the centre of the town, £53 million project. Stonehaven is 1 kilometre or so of flood defences through a very narrow corridor. Up at Garnock, a bit of a different scheme for North Ayrshire, in that we're creating an upstream storage facility combined with 3 other smaller interventions. And then lastly, Broughty Ferry, which is more of a coastal protection scheme. We're also building on our experience from delivering the Water of Leith for Edinburgh Council a few years ago, the River Ness Phase 2 for Highland Council. We currently have a scheme on for Network Rail down near Exeter, which is a flood resilience project to protect the railway, and we delivered Site X in Kent, which was creation of an inland storage facility just next to the Thames. So a little bit, very quickly, a couple of slides just about McLaughlin Harveys for those who may not know who we are. We're a privately owned building and civil engineering contractor. We've been around for just under 170 years, 700 odd employees. We have a turnover in the region of 500 million, 100 million or so of that is made up by civil engineering. Civil engineering team headquartered in Belfast, operating on projects throughout the UK. We also have facilities in London, Bristol, Liverpool, a major office in Glasgow, who a lot of the Scottish attendees here probably know, and a smaller office in Edinburgh. To what we do, as I said, predominantly construction, major building construction, civil engineering, but a little bit of facilities management and some specialist parts of the company. And in terms of sector involvement in the areas that you would come across McLaughlin's in civils, subject to today, river and coastal flood protection schemes. What we're predominantly known for, and probably makes up 60 to 70% of civils turnover, is heavy marine civils in ports and harbours, a little bit of roads, a little bit of rail, and then on the building front, predominant areas of industrial, health, education, retail, sporting venues as well, a bit of residential. Just to give a flavour for the sort of projects we have on the go, obviously the 4 projects we'll be speaking about today, and we're delivering projects all the way from Stornoway down through Scotland and England down to key wall strengthening Felixstowe. So we have a broad geographical spread around the country. So that's enough about us, and I will hand you over to Robin. The idea being we're going to run, hopefully everyone's broadband speed allowing, a quick drone footage of each job from taken within the last couple of weeks, and hopefully that comes through clear enough, and then Robin will run through some of the points raised on the project. Robin, over to you.
Thanks, Lee. Hopefully everyone can hear me. As Lee said, I'm involved in the Hawick Flood Protection Scheme for Scottish Borders Council. It's a £53 million project for McLaughlin Harveys, which is part of an overall £90 million investment for the council in the Scottish borders. The aim of the scheme is to protect around 900 commercial and residential properties across the town of Hawick from a 1 in 75 year flood event. The scheme involves construction of approximately 6 kilometres of new flood walls, generally sheet piled core with reinforced concrete pile cap and concrete stem wall, which is then cladded in various finishes of stone and concrete, etc. There's 3 new footbridges in the town to replace 3 existing footbridges, which link both sides of the river within the town. There's improved drainage infrastructure. There's 8 new surface water pumping stations to be constructed within the scheme. There's a new Scottish water pumping station being constructed. There's an upgrade of part of the A7 trunk road, which runs through the town, and lots of different bits and pieces that are basically going to make vast improvements to the town of Hawick. So this is just a bit of drone footage that was taken about a month ago. This is the lower downstream end of the town, where we are currently working on both sides of the river. You can see there the abutments being constructed for a replacement of that footbridge that you see. That's an existing footbridge. New footbridges are being raised. You can see on the left-hand side there the flood wall construction is underway and ongoing. You can see just there's 2 large diameter pump chambers on the left-hand side beside our office and our compound there. That's one of the surface water pumping stations, one of 8 on the scheme. As you come on down, this is the Mansfield Road, Lower Mansfield Road in Hawick. You can see on the left-hand side, the sort of right-hand side of the road there, the sheet piles have been installed. Haven't been able to install all those sheet piles to design tow level, but we'll come on to that later on. Left-hand side is the existing Scottish water treatment plant, and where the crane is, that's the location of where we're installing the new pumping station, currently under construction. That's another compound in there that we have as well. On the right-hand side, you can see a large storage area. We've been able to procure all the piles for the scheme last year when we came to site, which is very beneficial, getting them at the right price and getting them to site early. We're also looking at Hawick Rugby Club there on the left-hand side, and the work's ongoing down there at the minute, just involving the outfall to the pumping station. This is the middle section of the scheme. Apologies, this isn't in any particular order, but seems to have gone there, Lee. We can try and fast forward it a bit there. Yeah, another wee bit. There's a large outfall from the wastewater treatment plant then down to that area, that compound area behind the rugby club stand there. That work's currently ongoing. This is the middle part of the town, so you can see on the left-hand side, new flood wall constructed and clad in nice sandstone. That flood wall follows the back of the buildings up to Commercial Road, which is the A7 trunk road that runs through the town. You can see in the distance there the new green bridge. That's one of the bridge replacements that we installed on the 26th of July, with the previous bridge, slightly smaller and lower, has now been removed. But there's still a lot of work ongoing just to link that bridge and get concrete ramps and things built and services diverted across the bridge. Coming into work section 8, which has been one of the most difficult work sections to be constructed in the scheme. On the left-hand side there, it's one of the few areas where the flood wall isn't piled because we're down on bedrock, but there's a deep gravity retaining wall being constructed there at the minute from the river. So there's lots of constraints with working in the river that we'll come on to shortly after. But yeah, that's one of the most challenging areas. This is looking upstream then from that middle section. That's Hawick High School on the left-hand side. You can see the concrete flood wall has been constructed. There's a gap there because there's some additional works to do there next year. But we have that flood wall constructed right round the Hawick High School. This is Hawick Cricket Club. So the wall turns left there at the cricket club. So that cricket club is designed to flood. Footpath where the cursor is there is part of an extensive active travel network supported by Sustrans, which links footpaths in different areas across the town. That's just looking back the way. On the left-hand side, we've got the Commonhof car park where we have the flood walls largely finished. You can see a coffer dam in the middle of the river there. That's a central pier construction for, again, a new bridge, new replacement bridge linking the car park to the school. That's just looking back to the middle section that we've just been through. If anyone's noticed, there was a building that collapsed in Hawick in February 2020. That's been demolished as part of the scheme as well, or partially demolished. This is the western tie end of the scheme on the A7 trunk road. Flood walls are all complete in there, and we're sort of at the stage of finishing works, landscaping works, some road works, accommodation works around the cricket club, which is just to the left of the tennis courts there. The cricket stand to go in to basically link the cricket club to the wet side of the flood wall. So to say that footage is all taken about a month ago, and there's been lots of work has been ongoing since then. So hopefully that wasn't too quick. But just in terms of the scheme, it's client designed scheme by Jacobs. Jacobs are on site with us, working as one big team, and things are going pretty well. We commenced on site in it's actually June 2020 with our setups, and construction work started at the end of July last year. So we're about a third of the way through the scheme at the minute, and we have about a third of the scheme actually constructed. We're slightly behind where we had intended to be at this point due to some of the constraints with working on the river. But as I say, we can come on to that. Lots of good things about the scheme. One of the most advantageous things for us as a contractor coming to Hawick was prior to us starting in June, July last year, Scottish Borders Council spent the previous 2 years working on an advanced works contract, and they've diverted roughly 8 kilometres of existing utilities and services away from the sort of construction footprint of the flood scheme. So we have sort of only about 5% of utilities to actually deal with and divert as part of the main works contract. So that was a massive advantage and bonus for us coming to Hawick, where everything's been cleared in our path in front. Same with vegetation and tree clearance. Hawick is or used to be before this scheme, lots of big mature trees along the river banks, and all those trees have been taken out in advance of us commencing works. There was some road diversions you might have picked up there. There's a couple of supermarkets in the middle of the town, and there was a road diversion put in place as part of the advanced works to link the 2 supermarkets to enable us to close the main trunk road through the town on a phased approach, which again saves time and hassle and allows us to crack on with the works as planned. There's lots of good stakeholder liaison with key businesses and the high school as well. You can see we're one of the first areas we came to in Hawick was the high school, and we were in the middle of the school playground with diggers and piling rigs and causing quite a lot of disturbance and disruption in the area, but there was a lot of good liaison went on in advance of us coming to site, so that we're well aware of what was going to be happening. Although the town can be quite congested, certainly at school pickup times, the extent of the boundaries and land made available to the scheme has been pretty good. There have been several areas where we've been able to set up compounds for the likes of the pile yard that you saw down at the lower end of the scheme, with also a large steel fixing yard in the middle of the town, which basically serves the whole site and allows us to prefab a lot of the steel reinforcement for the flood walls and then ship them out to the various work sections across the town. So yeah, no, there's been lots of positive things there. You want to move on to the next slide there, Lee? Several areas, as I mentioned, for storage of materials. The site has also been divided up into flood modelling cells. which allows Jacobs to look at the sort of flood risk management as we build the scheme over the 3 years that we're going to be in Hawick. We've also split the scheme into approximately 40 work sections, which makes it easy, you know, in terms of programming and planning our works. It just makes the whole scheme easier to manage from a construction point of view. High tender quality marks were concentrated at tender stage on methodologies for some of the most difficult parts of the scheme. For example, the work section 8 gravity retaining wall. There was a detailed methodology put forward at tender stage as to how that would have been constructed, or was going to be constructed. Not saying it's being constructed in that particular methodology, but that was good. And as we mentioned, that's an employer design scheme, so reduced tender costs. Move on, Lee. Lessons learned in terms of the scheme. As I said, about 35% of the scheme is being constructed from the river channel. The constraints of working in the river channel are quite stringent, with the main works only permitted between the 1st of May and the 30th of September each year. So it really only, we're here for 3 years. It really only gives us 3 summer periods to construct 35% of the scheme, and that 35% is the most challenging part, because we're working in water and we've got all the environmental constraints that come along with that. So in order to do that, we have to install temporary works platforms. You know, basically from the 1st of May this year, we were in several areas constructing temporary works platforms for piling rigs and excavators to go in and put piles in and dig out for pile caps and reinforced concrete. So, you know, when you take that into consideration, the sort of 4 weeks, 3 to 4 weeks in May to install your temporary works, and then another couple of weeks at the end of September to start taking them out, which is the stage we're at now. We're starting to take out platforms on the river from the end of this week into next week and the following week. It only leaves a 4-month window of actual construction works within the river. So if you take out 4 months over 3 years, that's 12 months. Effectively, it's 1 year to build a third of the scheme. So it's probably right, but then you don't have any allowance for poor weather and high river levels and things like that. As I mentioned there, work section 8, which is the section in the middle of the town along Commercial Road, that's been the biggest challenge that we've had on the site to date. It involves 220 metres of new reinforced concrete retaining wall. You can see on the bottom left-hand side of the screen, I know it's small and hard to see, but that's the general cross section of what we're trying to do. So the lower part, we've got a lower base with a toe on the front of it on the wet side, with a sort of wide upper base, and then you've got a lower wall with a wall stem then rising up above the road, which is clad in sandstone. The picture on the right hand side shows us excavating from the river side. So the brown dirty water is not the river, that's our excavation. The right hand side of that photo shows the bank up to the A7 trunk road, which has largely been excavated out, and on the left hand side is the platform that is in the river. So we've basically had to prefab the steel for that lower base and set that steel in a sort of 6-7 foot deep hole, sort of blind in the middle of silty, dirty water, which has to be strictly contained within that excavation and not allowed to obviously enter into the river, into the water course. So it's been a real challenge because we've had to do that in the wet, and it's even just excavating that out was a major challenge, and keeping silt out of there and being sort of content that, you know, there was silt out there and stone sort of fallen into the excavation once the steel cage was set. And then placing underwater concrete has been a major challenge, but we've got through 50% of that challenge. We had planned to build 220 metres of wall this year. Been a real learning exercise, particularly through June, July. We've only really got into it from the start of August. So unfortunately, we'll not get the full extent of that wall built this year. We'll be building sort of 50% of it. But it's probably, there could have been other design proposals for elements of work like this. And one of the key things would be, earlier contractor involvement, to look at potential alternative piling techniques, such as a secant wall in this location, to try and avoid the challenges of working blind underwater and that sort of depth of water. It's not only a challenge in terms of health and safety, but in terms of quality and providing, what's in the specification and what's on the design has been difficult to achieve the tolerances that are required there. You want to move to the next slide, Lee, please. As I said, there's lots of environmental constraints as well. The Teviot River is a designated SAC and SSSI, and it's a rich habitat for salmon and lamprey, which I'd never heard of, lamprey, until I came to Hawick. Quite an ugly looking eel type fish, but they're protected and we need to respect that. So you can see there on the left hand side, this photo was taken in August last year. We attempted to do some Inchannel Works, even though we were only coming to site in the middle of the sort of working and river season. We did attempt, it was more of a trial run, if anything, to see how we could construct the platforms in stream. And you can see there with silt curtains around the platforms that were installed first. And you can see that it's really effective, that silt curtain, and holding back the sediment-laden water on the left-hand side, just downstream of the stone platform. The white stuff that you can see in the photos is geotextile wrapped straw bales and within gabion baskets, again, to sort of filter out the sediment. And there's a series of pumps set up to sort of de-water the dirty areas and try and recirculate it through silt busters and things to clean it out. Not entirely effective and a real challenge, but about a week after we put that platform in, that left-hand photo, a flood alert was issued by SEPA, and the river rose about 1 metre to 1.2 metres, and you can see there, you can barely just see the outline of the silt curtain, which has risen to the level of the river, but the platform's completely submerged. So a couple of days later, after the platform, after the river levels receded, you can see the third photo then, that's what's left of the platform. So significant part of the platform was washed out. We had precast, little precast concrete L walls protecting the edge, the river edge of that platform. They were all washed into the river, into a big deep scar hole just to the right hand side of the platform. And there was aggregate lost into the river channel, which isn't something that SEPA take too kindly to. So we had to go back. We got some minor work, but we got about 40 linear meters of sheet piles installed in the river last year, and sort of went back to the drawing board. And the photo on the right hand side, although it's very hard to see because it's quite taken from quite far away, that's what we've constructed this year. So you can see to the church building on the left hand side, to the right hand side of that, you can see the sheet piles. Those are the permanent sheet piles that are forming the flood wall construction. You can see the stone platform in the river in front of those sheet piles, and then you can see another row of sheet piles at the edge of the stone platform along the water's edge. So that's part of our sort of redesign of temporary works to protect the platforms. We've surrounded all our river platforms with temporary sheet piles. It's something that it's been a massive investment to McLaughlin Harveys on this scheme. Something that we never priced for or had any allowances for, but something that we had to do to avoid really to enable us to work in the river when the river levels did come up. We had some protection there with the sheet piles, and then from an environmental point of view, we obviously had protection from potential washout of aggregates into the watercourse. One thing on this scheme that we've found also quite challenging is probably direct engagement with SEPA, which is key to any flood scheme, particularly when you're working in a river like the Teviot, which is a rich habitat of fish. Direct engagement with SEPA is absolutely key from early stages. We obviously had meetings with SEPA prior to works commencing last summer, but just with the lessons learnt from last year, with those photos that you can see, the first 3 photos, we took several meetings and sort of lessons learnt meetings with SEPA and key stakeholders to see how we could improve things for this summer and beyond. And what you see on the right hand side is what we've done this year. And although we've been so lucky with the weather this year, we haven't had any flood warnings in the town throughout the whole summer. A few flood alerts that didn't come to anything. I suppose what I'm saying is the measures that we've put in this year haven't really been tested. The other thing I didn't mention was that the other reason for sort of protecting the river platforms with the piles, not only from a sort of high flow event and potential washout, it was also to contain silt within the platform area once we excavate down for flood wall construction. So once the piling is done, piling vibration obviously raises some silt within the platform. That silt was generally contained within the platform, within the stone bund, and the sort of 3-sided cofferdam sheet piles that were installed. But we found difficulty then when we went to excavate for the reinforced concrete works, because again, the flood wall construction involves digging down into the riverbed, and that example on the photo on the right hand side, formation level for a pile cap is probably about half a metre below riverbed, and you can't dig into the riverbed without rising silt, no matter what anyone says or thinks. It's not possible, and we knew that. And with the installation of those sheet piles, we thought the sheet piles would contain that silt, but the sheet piles didn't contain the silt. The silt's that fine that it's been able to make its way out through the clutches of the sheet piles. So that's been a challenge, and it's been something that SEPA have been, on our backs with terms of managing this and reporting silt and sediment releases into the river, which I have to say throughout the summer there's been several minor silt releases in the town, but when you are digging through natural riverbed material, it's near on impossible to avoid. One of the other constraints in the town is there's a number of adjacent buildings. Most of them are quite of historical. Some are listed, and we've got flood wall construction within a metre or a couple of metres of some of these buildings. You can see an example there on the 3 photos. The first photo on the left hand side, just where the A7 trunk road crosses the river, that building to the right hand side of that, at the bottom right hand side of the photo, is the church that we saw in the photos above, and our sheet pile flood wall is within sort of 4 foot of that building. There's very stringent vibration limitations within the contract for installing those piles, but it was a real challenge to install sheet piles and stick within the sort of 2 millimeters per second vibration limits. We looked at other piling techniques such as pile pressing, but lack of room to do that and existing ground conditions just didn't make that a possible methodology for installing those piles. So again, areas like that, there are other options for seeking piles and and different options that would, you know, maybe have less risk of causing damage to the building. That particular building in question, there's been extensive cracking to the western elevation of that building. So discussions with the owners of that building are ongoing at the minute, but you know, there would be other forms of construction that could have been considered, or you know, if some of these elements were maybe contractor design elements, it would give the likes of McLaughlin Harvey an opportunity to put other options on the table. Another thing that is probably worth discussing at this stage is the sheet piles that have been installed across the scheme. We've installed nearly 2/3 of the sheet piles across the entire project, sort of in the first year. Roughly 50% of those piles that have been installed, we haven't been able to drive them to design tool level. The original SI carried out during the design stages, there was about 40 boreholes carried out across the scheme, but there's been big variations, you know, across many of the work sections where, you know, we've been hitting a much higher level of rock than what the boreholes would have indicated. So I don't know if, you know, more SI would have flagged that up at the time, or more boreholes, but it's difficult, and it means that, you know, there's several areas, particularly, you know, where you're working in the river from the riverside on these temporary platforms that have to all be taken out by the end of September. There's areas where there's redesign required because the piles haven't been driven to design tool. So there's, in some cases, an extension of a pile retaining wall to be constructed to protect the actual flood wall construction. So we have part of the active travel network in front of the flood wall. So if Jacobs are having to redesign the outside edge of that footpath active travel network and provide a sheet piled retaining wall effectively to ensure that the footpath doesn't get washed out and the flood wall integrity isn't compromised during a flood event. There's other areas where we've had to install extensive riprap scar protection. You know, again, we're digging a couple of meters into the riverbed to key in the foundation stones. Been a bit of a challenge with doing that underwater, and you know, the silt that raises, although in that particular area where we've been able to contain the silt within sealed temporary sheet piles, but just when we go to remove those sheet piles, there's a lot of trapped silty water in behind them. Again, that's going to be a challenge dealing with that when it comes to removal of the platform and the piles from an environment view. Other areas have redesigned, have required anchor ties into rock and stuff. So you know, there's lots of issues that I don't know if potentially more site investigation or more boreholes may have picked up on previously at design stages. Lots of different finishes within the flood wall, as I touched upon. Some of the flood walls are plain concrete finish. Some of them have a Rackley form liner finish, which is like a ribbed, vertical rib pattern. And some of them then are cladded in sandstone, like what you can see in the photos attached. The photo on the right hand side shows sort of some of the walls that are clad in sandstone on one side and plain concrete or Rackley concrete on the other side. So there's lots of different finishes. And again, though, the stonework has been challenging too to get, you know, to what sort of the expectations of the council's landscape team and the designer's landscape team, what they are, has been quite onerous and achieving what everyone expects. The copes themselves have been difficult to manufacture. You know, it's natural stone material. There's going to be variations in colour, variations in the material when the likes of those half round copes are split. You know, the stone will split whatever way the stone wants to split. You know, so there's been a fair bit of wastage in terms of materials that, you know, haven't sort of come up to the required standards and quality that's required. Concrete spec, this is probably, I think that's the last thing I'm going to touch on in Hawick. The concrete specification called for a blended mix of either GGBS or PFA concrete. We couldn't source PFA this time last year when we were procuring our concrete supplier. We couldn't source an adequate supply of PFA for the full scheme. So we went with a GGBS blended mix, and that turned out to be difficult. The GGBS blended concrete was much slower to cure. It meant that we were having to leave formwork on poured walls for up to 4 days before we could strike the formwork, which meant that we had to bring in additional materials, additional formwork that we'd never envisaged, you know, to try and keep productivity going. Also, during the winter months, we were in the middle of GGBS, which then exacerbated that problem, where we couldn't strip formwork for up to 5 days in places. So we carried out extensive trials with a PFA blended mix once we realised this is a major showstopper on the scheme, and we eventually were able to source a supply of PFA for the entire scheme, but just trying to sell that point across to the council and the designers was quite challenging. More for the aesthetics of it, the fact that the PFA concrete is a slightly darker finish and looks slightly different. So when you've got exposed concrete across the town, you want it all to look the same. You don't want, you know, different colours of exposed concrete across the town. But glad to say that after lots of trials, we've been able to move our concrete design to PFA blend, and it's been a major gain in terms of program. You know, it's much quicker to gain strength, early strength, and we're able to strip formwork the next day in less than 24 hours, 16 hours. We can strike formwork and set up pours with the same formwork that we're pouring every day. So it's just something for consideration that, you know, I know personally for me, I'll not really consider GGBS blended concrete mixes in the future for that reason. But that, I think, Lee, is the last slide. So I'm going to hand over to David Baskin to talk about Stonehaven now. Thanks.
Hello folks, my name is David Baskin. I'm the contracts manager on Stonehaven flood prevention scheme. The scheme's valued at about £16 million plus, and it involves building a mix of foundation type walls in Stonehaven. The construction corridor is quite narrow. There was a number of bridges to be replaced, 3 bridges, and one, the white bridge that you can see in that photograph there, had to be restored as that was a protected structure. Removal of the island downstream of the Green Bridge was also carried out. We installed 2 number higher capacity culverts on the glass burn up at Lowood Road and the culvert under the cairn. This is a bit of drone footage taken about a month ago. You can see there that first blue structure is a temporary footbridge, and we've also got a 450 bile pumping main diversion on that there while we carried out the main works. This is section 4A by the beach. It's a tidal area as well, which raised some problems when you had winter events and backed up the flood, exacerbated the flood. We originally had our compound where the Aberdeen bypass site was, and then we moved it down into the town. We're just coming through section 1B now, which suffered some delays. And we started piling in there. It's a very tight area. You can see the kind of space you have with the 55-ton rig. The white bridge is just where those sandbags are. That'll be constructed when we complete 1B. We're moving up through section 1C now. There's a number of glass panels and self-raising barriers as well. The walls themselves some are gravity and some are piled structures. It's quite a narrow corner. This is the intersection of the two streams here where we put in the new green bridge and the flow control structures. You can see those rocks there are dialed into concrete beams cast in the riverbed. The wall closest to us there is sheet piled, and then with a cap and beam and RC stem wall. The walls are cladded in a granite material by and large, and then there's some rectiformer concrete finish as well on the culverts. This is coming up at the area 2G Karen Gardens, which is quite a flashy area to flood. There were several issues there with flooding, just trying to get it done. You can see there the working space again is very tight between the main road and the properties, and there's quite a steep embankment there that we had to put some temporary sheet piles in that actually ended up remaining there to give some additional stability to the road, as there were some concerns there. The key points on the scheme was it was a full plank design by Mott MacDonald with some contractor designed elements. They were the bridges. It commenced on site in January 19 and completion is due next year. The positive actions with stakeholder liaison. There was extensive support for the scheme in advance of the works. The community has been quite supportive overall. You'll always get some people that aren't supportive of it. They're usually the people that aren't affected when the area floods. Clearly defined parameters for in-channel working. That was very, very clear in the contract, that with 1 metre above bed level plus 50% of in-channel working width. Experienced client team, they had good experience of these flood schemes, and the project manager has been involved from its conception. The use of the off-site compound, as I said, was good. It was good storage area, and it enabled us to get a lot of materials called in early and take away some of those market risks. Clarity on sequencing the tender stage and constraints on the contractor program were well defined as well. Some of the sequencing changed just with some tweaks to section 1B there. Next slide, Lee. So I suppose the key lessons on the scheme is temporary works constructability should be looked at and considered in more detail by the designer at early stage. Consider contractor input at early stages. Sometimes where space is at a premium, the temporary works and the permanent works are very intricate. And in 1B, for example, there's a culvert being constructed, but in the temporary state, that culvert will have props from each of the cap and beams that help retain the existing structures there. Also, there's a number of areas where the permanent works was designed with CFA piles because of drivability issues for sheets, but in a lot of those areas we needed sheets for the temporary works to allow for the in-channel working to get down in below riverbed level, so that there obviously needed a bit more work. Explore ways of designing walls on top of riverbanks rather than below riverbed level. Concrete works in the wet to be avoided. I think we all know we'd love to work out of the river. It's not always possible, especially when you have a very narrow corridor. But where we are in the wet, we should look at precasting and aim to maximise the opportunities of precasting walls and cap and beams and things like that there that we've done on other schemes. Utility diversions, complete more of the utility diversions before the main construction work starts. We had a number of utility diversions to do, which involved gas, water, electricity, and if they could be done in an advanced work package, that would be helpful to the program as well. Sometimes when we're dealing with utility providers, it's very difficult to get everybody lined up when they're needed. Contractor design scope should be clearly defined with no ambiguity between who's designing what. It wasn't a massive issue here, to be fair. Tree protection, along section 1C, we had quite a few protected trees. We should try to look at removing them if we can. in one section, we ultimately did have to remove them and then replace them later on because constructing the wall would have been difficult or impossible. Reinstatement, we're coming to the end of a lot of the scheme here, as you've seen in the drone footage there, and the reinstatement of the existing roads is a topic that we're dealing with now at the minute. I think it would be good if there was more thought put into the reinstatement, considering the amount of construction traffic or just heavy haulage in the area, and maybe an opportunity for local authorities to liaise with the roads team as well, that when we're constructing the flood works, maybe construction of roads or upgrading of roads can be considered at the same time. Barriers and gates, so just standardization of barrier systems maybe across the sector would be good, because there's multiple different systems and suppliers, and they can be tricky to install some of them. Next slide, Lee. The biggest thing that I've experienced here is space for piling equipment. You can see there that piling rig is approximately 60 tons. It's driving piles about 500 mil from stone built buildings, which can prove very, very risky. We have changed the piling methodology there and the types of piles in this area. So when we done the outside or the center line of the culvert, if you can see there probably in the first photo just below the concrete pipe, we just use traditional CFA piling methodology. But for the piles close to the existing buildings, we've opted for a cased CFA option, which reduces vibration and reduces the risk of overflighting as well. But the big lesson to be learned, and I know we can only build in the footprint we have, is the type of construction in those very, very tight areas. We can't even get rigs past each other there. We had also tried to look at putting a second rig in there to improve on the program, but it proved impossible with concrete supply and different elements of plant that's needed. So a big key is the working corridor for the works, especially in areas where you have old buildings that would be at risk. Okay, Lee. That's the main thing for me. Just to note on working space and precast where possible will be my two main lessons learned from the Stonehaven flood mitigation scheme. All right, thank you.
Okay, I think everybody can hear me now, hopefully. My name is Adrian Pollock and I'm the Contracts Manager. I'm working on the Upper Garnock Valley Flood Protection Scheme. It's a project for North Ayrshire Council and valued just at over 12.5 million there. So as Lee noted earlier on there, it's a bit different from Hawick and Stonehaven in the sense that while some areas are similar and you have the Inchannel working in that, ultimately the main part here is a flood storage reservoir, which is up there, as you can see, in Area 1, just north of Kilbirnie town. The other areas, Area 2 down in Kilbirnie and Area 3 in Garnock, which is on one of the tributaries in the Powgree Burn, are more traditional Inchannel working, reconstructing new flood walls and the like. And Area 4 then down in Dalry, we have some sheet piling methods. So just a quick video here to give an overview of the project. As you can see there, the sites are located southwest of Glasgow there in the Garnock Valley, the 4 areas identified there, as we mentioned. Area 1 then is the flood storage reservoir just north of Kilbirnie. It really consists of an earth embankment which forms a dam within the Garnock River, and ultimately this will impound the water and restrict flows downstream into Kilbirnie and onward. The embankment consists mainly of imported material with some site processing being used where possible. There's also it's 5 main materials make up the dam itself. In order to access, we have a temporary bridge there spanning across the river to give us access to both sides. And we had to divert the river there to allow construction of the precast culvert, and you can see the inlet structure there, which ultimately is the flow restrictor, and it causes the impound of water. The site's about 10 hectares in size, and that allows for the dam, the material storage processing, and the surface water management. The second area then is Kilburnie town itself. This is more Inchannel working, although there is an earth embankment there, as you can see in the near ground there, which protects the Paddock Home industrial estate. There's a new footpath constructed on top of that as well. Another part of this section is a replacement of an existing flood wall. This is using, whilst it has an in situ foundation, it has used a modular precast system for the actual flood wall itself, as you can see there from the image. The third section then is third areas in Garnock and the Powgree Burn, which, as I said, is a tributary. It's quite a confined space, this one. We're working between the Glendale Arms pub and also the Network Rail railway track there. It's the main objective there is to replace the flood wall. To do this, we've had to pipe the existing burn there to create a dry working space. This one's currently ongoing there, as you can see. It's quite complex technical works in this area just to support the existing buildings, and deep excavation was needed, which was difficult, and we'll talk about. So area 4 then is the Dalry defences. There's some works in the DSM factory, which is in the background there, mainly concrete retaining walls and flood bunds. In addition then, along the Network rail embankment, we've got 320 metres there of sheet piling. That's really to protect the rail embankment, and was installed using vibratory methods, and that was successfully done along the embankment, complying with the various restrictions that Network Rail imposed. Also, there's the Beath Road flood wall, 220 metre sheet piles there. We used pile press methods, hydraulic press, obviously given the close proximity of the houses. And just finally down in that area then there's embankment, about 1,000 metres of embankment regrade works there again to stabilise the total embankment during the flooding. So that gives sort of an overview just of the site as it is. So I suppose moving on then just quickly to the key points of the job. It is a client design, and that was completed by AECOM on behalf of the council. Some contractor designed elements within that, primarily the fish pass up at the work unit 1 at the dam, and also down at work unit 4. There were 3 pipe crossings where we had to span Scottish water infrastructure, sewer mains and the like, and there's a grouting design required around those. So albeit there was concept designs in place, there was ultimately a contractor design to take those forward. Work commenced on site last year in August and runs through to springtime next year, 2022. So yeah, similar to the other ones, some good positive aspects, and just to run through them quickly, I suppose. In terms of landowner engagement, particularly up at work unit 1, which is the dam, and down at work unit 4, there was a substantial land take required from local landowners. We found that the client or the council had fully engaged with all the landowners via various agents, and the work scope was clearly understood there, and you know, I think in terms even from a construction phase perspective, it was quite well understood, and which ultimately there was land agreements in place which were quite robust then, which meant we didn't really, or we haven't to date, incurred major issues with the landowners, which has been good. They've also identified the need. The local road infrastructure, particularly up around work unit 1, it's a small, relatively country type road, single track. Large amount of construction traffic required, particularly with the volume of import. We're talking in the region of 80,000 cubic material coming in, not including concrete or the like, just pure embankment fill. So they identified that, I think, and ultimately the design included for some passing bays and the like up that road, which ultimately has probably mitigated a lot of complaints that we could have seen had that advanced work not have been carried out. So that was a positive thing. Also, in terms of flood management, there was good understanding from the client side and the design team about the various stages and how the buildability of the dam would take place. And I think what I mean particularly there is there was a need to impound at a midpoint, if you like, and ultimately get a sort of a section. It's not sectional, but a handover or an impoundment certificate to allow the dam to be filled in its partially completed state. So that was identified, and the methodology was built around that. So it was quite clear from early doors how that was going to come together, which was good. I know Hawick touched on this. Here we possibly slightly different in the sense that I think there was good SEPA engagement here. We were allowed to consult with SEPA during the tender stage, and that ultimately led to a relationship being developed, which in turn meant that we were fully aware of the various constraints, and we were able to move things in the programme where we possibly could and work with SEPA and work with the various restrictions with minimal disruption to the actual project. So that was a positive. Again, similar to the other ones, the utility diversions, the council done advanced work there in terms of diverting utilities and the like. Particularly there was HV cables down at on Dalry there on the Beath Road section, so that enabled the permanent works then to be installed with minimal requirement to do any further diversion works. Also, there was the Scottish Water Sewers, and again, albeit that's a contractor designed element, as I noted, the council had engagement with Scottish Water and had conceptual designs agreed in principle, so that whenever it came with the contractor design, you know, there was advanced engagement taking place there, so that was positive. Again, from a contamination perspective, obviously we're working there in an old industrial town, particularly Kilbirnie and Garnock, and there's a lot of brownfield sites there where contamination is a risk, what with the coal works and one thing and another. So there were allowances made within the contract, which ultimately assisted and it reduced the risk allocation from ourselves. It set the criteria so that all bidders were playing off a level field, if you like, which we felt was good. And then, as I say, probably the last one there, piling adjacent to houses. So again, methodology was clearly defined within the contract documents or the tender documents, which the use of the pile press for the section down in Beath Road, as you can see, they're working in very close proximity to the adjacent properties. And just the photo on the right there shows you sort of, again, it doesn't look as tight perhaps as Stonehaven, but when you bring in a 70-ton crane plus all the materials and that, you're quite constrained there with working space, and it has to work in a very linear manner. You can't get back and forward past yourself. So working space is another key focus. So thank you, Lee. Next one, right? Okay, lessons learned then. I think probably the main ones here, concerns that as a contractor, when we sometimes see open tender jobs, it can be, I wouldn't say put off, but we sometimes look at them a bit more cautiously in the sense that, you know, they're open to possibly less experienced contractors. You know, particularly in this one, there was quite a network rail interface down in work unit 4. So you're always aware that there's somebody with less awareness that we may have and can come in and undercut or underbid or potentially ultimately it cause problems later on then. So that was one thing that we prefer if we're select lists and the like, as opposed to the open tender jobs. Material specification, and this one particularly, I'm probably referring to the dam itself. As I say, the main dam, the dam material was primarily imported, albeit we have worked with the council and we're trying to reuse and process where possible and relax specifications where at all possible. However, generally speaking, that was the materials that were selected. They're an owner's specification, and what we found was they're not readily available from the local quarries. Which ultimately resulted in increased haulage, and we had to take on the various processing then as well, quite a bit of processing, which in turn had an impact on carbon footprint and ultimately the cost, because it wasn't the material that was just readily available. There may be design reasons for that, but it's just something to bear in mind that you know, to have an element of flexibility there at an early stage to try to make use of what is readily available to you, either on site in terms of Site 1 or else local quarries. So the next one is appreciation of the land take. Whilst I did say the landowner agreement had been very well set out, again, it's a hindsight thing. I don't think it possibly maybe should have been foreseen, but looking at it from where we're at now, the working area, albeit that was a 10 hectare site, 25 acres or thereabouts up there, which seems quite substantial for what was being done. However, when you take topsoil strips, stockpiling of topsoil and restrictions upon that, you need to import large quantities of material, obviously, to have a stockpile to work from as you build. That coupled with just generally surface water management, we're working in the Garnock Valley, large catchment area, a lot of water, needs a lot of settlement ponds and all the rest to ensure that we don't have any discharges, unacceptable discharges into the Garnock River. So when you add all those factors together, you know, the land take soon disappears, and there's limited space then to carry out the processing that we would have liked to have probably tried out to try to make full reuse of the materials that we were winning on site to avoid any disposal off site. So something just to, I suppose, in a scheme like this, again, it's the appreciation of the land take. So in terms of design, selection and constructability, again, this one's been touched on the other schemes. I think really trying to work within river channels, excavating at low levels for mass in situ concrete gravity walls is extremely difficult, particularly at depth when you're below the riverbed. So all we would probably, from a lessons learned perspective here, look for top-down installations, be it sheet piling or CCAST or CFA boring, something along those lines, and maybe introduce precast, which was done here, in fairness, albeit the foundations generally were in situ on this job. We think that top-down solutions would definitely be worthwhile to be considered. And in invasive species, then there was a bio security management plan in place. However, there haven't been any advanced treatment, and I appreciate that could be down to procurement timescales and one thing and another. But where you have the opportunity, it's cost-effective to try to get in there early, to get in, set up treatment plans over the years leading up to construction, which ultimately reduces the cost then for disposal off-site. Engagement with Network Rail, this was something that we probably struggled a wee bit with at tender stage. We were unsure. Obviously, engagement with Network Rail was limited during the tender period, and it wasn't really clear what their working restrictions were. Whilst we have some Network Rail experience, different regions tend to operate slightly differently. So the requirements that they were going to put upon us in terms of possession and isolations of the overhead electric equipment, we weren't entirely sure how that was going to work. So I think a bit more early engagement with Network Rail would be beneficial. Advanced service diversion, what I mean in this one is whilst advanced services were carried out well, the one thing that possibly could be done better is the consideration to where the service companies are actually putting the diverted cables. On occasion, yes, they moved them out of the permanent works. However, they were moved within where the temporary works were needed, and in particular, I'm thinking of things like piling mats and crane pads. So it's important when you are diverting services to give consideration where the actual temporary construction is going and make sure that they fall out with that. So procurement aligning with programme, a general one that probably applies to most flood schemes, this one. Ultimately, the award date of the contract's key. And with the award coming here sort of early summer, it just allowed us to get the river diversion completed before the SEPA restrictions that came in at the end of September/October time. That was okay. There wasn't much room for float, but it was delivered and it was done okay. However, it then meant our bulk earthworks took place throughout the winter. So an earlier award in this particular case would have assisted us when it came to the bulk earthworks being completed in a more summer period. But something where you can, I understand there's constraints obviously with that, but it's something to look at. GI again, it came up in Hawick too. You can't have enough of it, and it's getting the balance, I suppose. But I know just we had a lack of it in one of the particular work units, and it's proven costly for us there that we didn't have a full understanding of what we were working with. And finally, the working period conflicts. So again, as with the other ones, you're working in a very tight window between May and the end of September, primarily there for the in-channel working, and even in some cases, particularly that powdery burn, when you actually look at the various species, the restrictions are throughout the entire year. So it's knowing and understanding the constraints during the tender stage. Sometimes that can be difficult, albeit, as I say here, we had good liaison and discussion with SEPA, which ultimately painted that picture for us. So, but no, I think that's all I have on my side.
Hello, can you hear me all right?
Yep, John, we can hear you fine. Thanks.
Okay, that's great. I'm just going to have a quick run through Broughty Ferry. The flood protection scheme is currently on site at the moment in Dundee, and primarily going to focus on Douglas Terrace, one of the areas. But a quick overview of the project. Primarily, it's a coastal protection scheme because it's in the estuary of the River Tay. It provides a new seawall and structures to provide coastal flood protection, and the whole scheme is designed to reduce the flooding risk to the, I suppose, residential houses, open space communities, and business properties. And we're just going to run through a quick video. Essentially, it runs the length of Douglas Terrace, which is almost about 800 meters long, and then it moves into section 2 works, which would be and then on through to Beach Crescent. This is primarily Douglas Terrace, which is already complete. So you can see we have to deal with the tide fluctuation on a daily basis, where the works are constantly getting wetted and dried, and we've had to put in some temporary working platforms to allow us to construct the works. And essentially the main project itself was a build out of approximately 4 meters from the existing revetment out into the sea or the estuary, and then there's some scour protection works along the front, which ultimately creates a new promenade and an active cycle or travel network that stretches the whole way into Dundee itself. So again, just some interfaces with some of the local infrastructure and the RLNI that had to be kept live during the project access. Just Fisher Street, again, a lower level retaining wall and retaining some of the green space to the front. And then Beach Crescent, which is a terraced area, hopefully to allow the locals eat their ice cream on a nice sunny day in Broughty Ferry. And again, that's just some more piling works and temporary access platforms that we had to put in place to accommodate the works. So on the slide here, primarily the scheme's broken into 3 phases. Section 1, Douglas Terrace to James's Place. Section 2, Fisher Street, and then Section 3, Beach Crescent. So just going to primarily talk about Section 1, Douglas Terrace. So the existing revetment that you can see is an old stone pitched revetment, probably in the order of 100 odd years old, with a footpath with no safety railing on the side. And on the beach itself in the early 2000s, a GRP rising main was constructed and a concrete culvert to convey all the wastewater for the area down to a nearby pumping station and onto a treatment facility. The alignment of that culvert, the offset changes as you go along the length of the scheme, and as you get closer to James's Place, it gets quite tight to the toe of the new structure. So we did have some challenges in relation to how we would construct it. The client's concept was to have a vertical retaining wall with a build out. So you can see the blue line there would be the existing revetment, and then we had found a retaining wall, and then I suppose there was some coastal modelling carried out that identified potential scour that could occur up to maybe 2.7 metres below existing beach level, which was a key driver in the final solution. And again, some of the challenges, I suppose, for the scheme, we were appointed to provide some ECI advice and support to Dundee City Council, and a number of previous contractors had formally priced the project which exceeded the budget and made the scheme unachievable. And I suppose primarily they were going down a more traditional sheet piling route, where they wanted to install sheet piles to shore up the Hatton rising main, and the concern from Tay Catchment or Veolia or Scottish Water ultimately on the GRP rising main is quite susceptible to distortion, and the vibration and potential piping could cause issues and cause that pipe to burst, and it's obviously strategically important for the area. Again, the ground conditions are quite challenging there. You've got quite a lot of running sands, and there's been previous experiences of piping issues on that site itself. There was again a preference to omit vibro piling adjacent to the rising main. Again, local residents, some of the properties are quite close. Vibration was an issue when the previous scheme for installing the culvert and the rising main were installed. Obviously, it's also a popular tourist area, recreational beach for Dundee access, weight and height restrictions along the railway crossings. There was also a need to minimise road closures, maintain access alongside the landside footway, because it is still used as an active travel route to get people into Dundee City. And again, we needed to make sure we accommodated waste disposal and emergency services, and ensure we had phased the works in such a manner that we had phased traffic management. I suppose these were key drivers for Dundee City Council as a client, and I suppose they would have led to us coming up with our final design solution. And again, just the coastal modelling study by others identified a potential scour of 1.7 metres on the beach, and then we also need to make an allowance of an additional metre, so any further scour or foundation needed to be set 2.7 metres below the existing beach level. The challenges we had here would have been that we would have completely undermined the existing revetment, and which was supporting the road network, and it had some challenges. I suppose one thing that can be a note here is we had some good dialogue with Dundee City Council on how best to approach this, but ultimately some very early stage and preliminary reports can put in notes of restriction that dictate maybe how a design has to evolve over time, where in fact if more focused analysis was carried out, you may be able to relax it. And again, the Hatton Main, just as we're showing here, was constructed in the early 2000s by others. There was actually an instance of running sands on this site where unfortunately there was a fatality. So it was key for us to avoid the need to undertake deep excavation, and again to minimise the vibration for the Hatton rising main, because there was nominal deflections permitted. So ultimately we came up with a solution, going back to what Adrian was saying, to try and use precast elements and avoid working at low level, because we were going to be in the intertidal zone where we were constantly being flooded out essentially. We come up with a solution whereby we installed a temporary platform at a higher level, which was about half a metre above mean high water springs. We then come up with a rotary board piling technique, which significantly reduced any vibration, and we cased all of those piles to avoid any issues with running sands as we constructed it. Then we excavated down locally, and we had a precast trough beam, which allowed us to pour the foundation for the wall itself. And by being able to quickly complete the excavation and drop in the precast and do a temporary backfill, that allowed us then to, I suppose, provide temporary trench support, and it also allowed us to form the permanent works without the need for extended periods of time installing formwork and striking formwork. Once we then got the precast trough beam installed, we did an in situ pour, and then on top of that we placed an L wall, precast L wall, and the benefits again, it meant we got up out of the water zone and the flooded zone quite quickly to allow us to complete the works. And then we had an in situ capping beam on top of the wall, which tied everything together. I suppose one of the real benefits on this scheme, we come up with a solution to minimise the over reliance on the scour protection that we had to get down to the minus 2.7 by having a pragmatic view of historical studies and monitoring of the levels of the beach and the sand, and then by placing in a scour protection mattress, which I suppose has offered both programme and cost savings to the client. And again, just here's a quick cross section of the pile you can see on the lower section with the cyan coloured in situ concrete with inside the U trough beam, and then the wall panel on top. And the wall panel on top was connected to the foundation pour with an in situ stitch, and then a further precast stitch at the top. And this, I suppose, is a slide during the construction period where you can see the lower section on the plain finish, which is partially buried along the beach. Once it's finally regraded out, is just a fair face finish, and then we had the upper section with a Reckley or a type finish, and then the in situ capping beam, and then this is the promenade, now a 4 metre wide active travel network, which accommodates both cyclists and pedestrians along the route. And then we had further streetscape works or public realm to enhance, and the setback wall that you see here on the left actually also helped raise the level of the flood protection. So ultimately the small setback wall is the final defence on any flood events. And again, by using both walls rather than having one significantly high wall at the front, you get the benefit of the views out to sea. I think that's the last slide. Is that right, Lee?
Yeah, that's us.
Yep.
So apologies, we overran a little bit, but hopefully that was interesting.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, everybody. Can I just ask all the participants to turn the cameras and the microphones back on, and we'll start the question and answer session. And just a thanks to the presenting group at McLaughlin Harvey for sharing their insight and experience with us. Really quite an interesting project there. Just to start off the Q&A, I've got a question here from Gavin in the audience. Given there are 40 sections, how responsive were subcontractors when it came to downtime, given the constraints working between May and August?
I think Robin had to drop off to answer that question. You just had another meeting that kicked off at 12, so unfortunately had to drop off. But from our perspective, it's about planning. I mean, I think the work sections that were set up on Hawick, and that was set up by the client, not by us. Initially, it was a logical breakdown of the project, such that everybody knows who's talking when you might say work section 8 or work section 33 or 22. Everybody knows where that is, rather than a chainage or by certain street. It's about managing the in-channel periods and us as a normal contractor managing how we go about the works. As Robin said, there's probably about a third of it is in-channel, and that's planned that you hit it hard over the summer period, and then in the winter period, those same subcontractors move on to the top of bank works. But we've also planned, there's contingencies planned in that if we have high flow events and that prevents us getting into the in-channel working for, say, a week, that those guys can move on to other work zones and carry on.
And just building on that, I am assuming that early contractor involvement plays a part in being able to cope with that type of pressure.
Yes, I suppose in terms of moving people around from area to area, that's more our day-to-day job as a contractor managing the project. But where I think possibly some ECI advice on Hawick would have assisted, a couple of areas that Robin flagged up where we've been having some, or certainly technically challenging areas, and it's an employer design scheme, and I think we would traditionally look where we think we can add benefit. We look at alternate proposals at tender stage. Now that wasn't, and I think Scottish Borders Council intent was that everybody tendering would be tendering on a like-for-like basis, and hence there was no alternatives to be considered. But I think from what we've been presenting across the schemes, where there are difficulties or potential problems that the consultant team's not sure what the best approach may be, then we're happy that they get either dealt with through an ECI process, i.e. engage with us as a contractor, which can be done in many different ways, or free those areas up to allow a bit of innovation within our tender submission. A scheme like Hawick we'd very much support, having been an employer design scheme, because 6 kilometres of flood defences at a tender stage would have been a very expensive tender for us to take on. And generally you'll find most flood schemes are 80% reasonably straightforward and 20% really difficult. And it's maybe concentrating, if there are to be contractor design elements or inputs, let us look at those difficult bits, ideally as early as possible. And the other elements, if it's a full D&B, you end up with 4 contractors spending money to reinvent the same proposal.
That makes total sense. Quick question here from Eleanor in the audience. Where employer design is recognised as not being the best solution, have the contractor been able to propose a change to suit the situation?
John, do you want to take that one, or?
Yeah, I suppose we'll always have a solution to something, and sometimes solutions suit to what your experience has been historically, and maybe you adapt it slightly because you have better comfort in how you can manage the risks associated with something. Because generally where it's always the awkward places and the places that people shy away from, and I think, as Lee said, it's maybe the 20% of the scheme is the awkward bits, and there's always someone within the team that has experience of certain parts of the issues that can be overcome, and it can be simply just looking at looking at the ground conditions, looking at the access available for particular types of equipment available. There's always equipment and processes evolving. There's new systems out there that are worth exploring at all opportunities, and I suppose it's just keeping an open mind. But again, probably as Adrian mentioned earlier, available working room and securing that available working room is probably one of the key drivers to getting a cost-effective final solution.
The other thing I would add to that too, John, is like, you know, whilst we may come up with solutions, and it leads back to Lee's point on the ECA, the early contractor involvement, you know, sometimes when we get there, we can see a better way of doing it, but it's too late. You know, river restrictions, whatever may play a part, and you just can't get it delivered in the timescales you've got. So that just brings it all back around to the ECA, you know.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And you know, in the past, we've done under various areas where we've done things informally, where, you know, we have a relationship with a consultant or a particular client, and we've been asked, could you look at this and give us some ideas, and the client's taken that on board and develop things, and that's something we do regularly on an informal basis. Also be that budgeting or programming, because we have tendered a number of flood schemes in Scotland of late where the tendered sums have exceeded the client's available budget, because the budget's been put together in such a way that you know, that using historic rates or however the budget was pulled together, without necessarily getting a contractor to look at it, because 100 metres of wall in one location, albeit the same form of construction, could be 2 or 3 times the price of it in another section, just because of the temporary works and the access arrangement. So, and it's making sure that that's considered. So the benefits of speaking to us early is, one, looking at those difficult constructability details, but also advise on budgeting costing, because the worst thing, I suppose, for client teams is you've been working on a scheme for 4 years, you put it out to tender, and then suddenly it's unaffordable.
Yeah,
and the budget's wrong. One
final thing just to add to that is probably the statutory consents that are required for schemes. We all know it's challenging to achieve those consents, and sometimes you might decide it's better to be more prescriptive to make sure you get your consents to allow the scheme to proceed. But sometimes being too prescriptive can, you know, cause more challenges down the line, because, as Lee said, it really focuses you on a particular solution that you then, and as Adrian said, you see a better way, but you're restricted with all the constraints that there's no other way to do it, only by the means that's already consented. So it's trying to have a broad enough overview of how you'd like to construct it without being too prescriptive when you're applying for your consent.
That all makes sense. That all makes sense. Thank you. Just one final question before we wrap up. Was pre-drilling required for temporary and permanent sheet piles?
I can take that one if you like, Lee. It's
yeah.
I suppose I can only speak for Upper Garnock, but I know yes is the answer. It depends on the ground conditions, and it depends on the piling methods. If you're looking at hydraulic pressing, chances are you may do, but again, in our particular case, 50% of the hydraulic press needed pre-drill, 50% didn't. None of the vibratory installed required pre-drill. So it just depends on what you come against, you know.
Certainly, I think on Hawick we had allowed for a fair bit of pre-drilling at tender stage, and again, the pile press was proposed in a number of areas, but the pile press can be problematic if the ground conditions aren't quite right, mainly because as you're pushing down using the pressure on the previously installed piles, you can at times end up pulling the piles out the ground rather than pushing them down. So a careful selection of piling method. And again, sometimes we're locked into that sheet pile solution, and the pile press is, you know, it's a vibrationless system, you know, it's fine. But then if you can't get the piles in because of the ground conditions and the other constraints, then sometimes you're better off looking at things like a secant pile wall. An example on Hawick is probably where we're very close to existing buildings. It might have been, I think it was considered early doors by the client team, and it's just maybe if we'd been involved earlier doors, we could have influenced that a little bit.
Okay, no, that's really interesting feedback. Thank you very much. I'm afraid just in the interest of time, we'll need to wrap it up there, but just a big thank you to the audience for joining us and for the important questions to the panel, for sharing their thoughts and insightful discussions. We have a few post details and relevant links which will be shared, and if you haven't already, please remember to download the handouts before exiting the event. Your feedback is extremely important to us, so please take a minute to fill this out after today's event, and all appropriate links will be shared in due course. So thank you again, everyone, and all the best. Thanks.
Cheers.
Thanks.
Yep.